hold a Mefo bill from 1935 in your palm. Feel its texture-cheap paper, thinner than a modern dollar, printed with black ink that smudges if you rub too hard. The inscription reads, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft MBH, the Metallurgical Research Corporation. It promises payment of 10,000 Reichsmarks in 5 years, bearing the signature of Dr. Dial, Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank. It was issued on March 14, 1935, processed through a Berlin clearinghouse, and used to purchase steel plates for what the paperwork called agricultural machinery. But this bill funded a Panzer tank, not because Germany had money, not because foreign banks extended credit, not because the Treaty of Versailles had been repealed, but because this piece of paper was the most consequential financial fraud in human history, a shadow currency that didn't legally exist, issued by a company that did nothing, backed by a government that was technically bankrupt. Behind the neoclassical columns of the Reichsbank, the men running a shattered nation knew a terrifying secret. They were building the world's most powerful military on phantom credit. The bill in your hand was worthless the day it was printed, yet it armed the Wehrmacht. This Mefo bill survived World War II. 50 million people didn't, and the reason it worked tells you everything you need to know about how bankrupt nations hide insolvency, including the one printing your currency right now. History remembers Adolf Hitler. It remembers Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, the architects of genocide, the faces of fascism, but history has conveniently forgotten the man who made it all financially possible. His name was Hjalmar Schacht, and he was the most dangerous kind of accomplice, the respectable one, the banker in the bespoke suit, the technocrat with impeccable credentials, the financial wizard who could make a bankrupt nation look solvent enough to build a war machine. Here's the question that should terrify you. How does a country with no gold reserves, no foreign credit, and explicit treaty prohibitions against rearmament manage to construct the most powerful military force on Earth in just 6 years? The answer isn't willpower. It isn't ideology. It's accounting fraud on a scale so massive that it bent the arc of the 20th century toward catastrophe. Schacht invented a shadow currency that existed in the gap between legal reality and material reality, a financial weapon that turned insolvency into tanks, desperation into dive bombers, and the truly disturbing part, we're doing it again, right now. Central banks around the world are engaging in the same sleight of hand, creating money from nothing, hiding debt off official balance sheets, promising future payment for present consumption, quantitative easing, special purpose vehicles, sovereign debt spirals. Different names, same game. Understanding Schacht isn't just about understanding how World War II was financed. It's about understanding how your government is financing its present obligations with your future solvency. The Mefo bill was a lie that killed 50 million people. What lies are holding up your economy right now? Stay with me, and I'll show you exactly how the con works and why the men who run it always walk away unpunished. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht was not a Nazi. That was precisely why Hitler needed him. Born in 1877 to a middle-class family in Tinglev, Denmark, Schacht was named after the American newspaper editor Horace Greeley, his father's Democratic hero. He earned his doctorate in economics from the University of Berlin, writing his dissertation on British mercantilism. By 1923, he'd become the Commissioner of National Currency, tasked with solving the single greatest economic catastrophe in modern history, Weimar hyperinflation. Picture this. In November 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Workers were paid twice a day because their morning wages would be worthless by afternoon. Families burned money in their stoves because it was cheaper than buying firewood. The German middle class, the engineers, teachers, doctors, civil servants, watched their life savings evaporate into numerical absurdity. Schacht stopped it cold. On November 15, 1923, he introduced the Rentenmark, a new currency backed not by gold, but by the theoretical value of all German land and industrial capital. It was a psychological trick, a confidence game played at the national level, but it worked. Hyperinflation ended within weeks. The exchange rate stabilized. Germany exhaled. Schacht became a magician, the man who had turned monetary chaos back into bread you could actually buy. By 1924, he was president of the Reichsbank. By 1929, he was internationally celebrated. dining with central bankers in London and New York, praised as the architect of Germany's recovery. Then came 1933. Hitler seized power in January, and by March, he summoned Schacht to a meeting. The Führer's request was simple: make Germany's rearmament financially invisible. Schacht knew exactly what this meant. Germany was bound by the Treaty of Versailles, which explicitly prohibited a standing army larger than 100,000 men, banned tanks and military aircraft entirely, and strangled Germany's economy with reparations payments. The nation had no gold reserves worth mentioning. Foreign creditors wouldn't touch German bonds. The government was technically insolvent, and Hitler wanted to build the world's most advanced air force, mechanized army, and submarine fleet immediately. Any orthodox economist would have said it was impossible. Schacht said yes within the hour. The genius of the Mefo bill scheme was its elegant simplicity. Schacht couldn't have the German government issue debt directly that would be visible to foreign observers and violate Versailles Treaty obligations. So he created a shell company. In May 1933, 4 of Germany's largest armaments manufacturers, Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Guthoffnungsschütte, formed a joint enterprise called the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or Mefo for short. On paper, Mefo was a metals research corporation with a modest capitalization of 1 million Reichsmarks. In reality, it existed solely to issue bills of exchange, essentially IOUs, that armaments companies could use as payment. Here's how the circular machine worked. The German government placed an order with Krupp for artillery shells. Krupp accepted payment not in cash, but in Mefo bills, promissory notes guaranteed by the Reichsbank, payable in 5 years. Krupp could then take those Mefo bills to any German bank and exchange them for immediate Reichsmarks at a small discount. The bank, in turn, could redeem the Mefo bills at the Reichsbank at any time. The Reichsbank guaranteed the entire system with its signature, Schacht's signature. But here's the criminal brilliance. Mefo bills didn't appear on the official government budget. They weren't classified as national debt. They were private commercial instruments, technically issued by a private company. Even though everyone involved knew the Reichsbank was the ultimate guarantor, foreign economists studying Germany's public finances saw a remarkably disciplined budget. The League of Nations inspectors found no evidence of treaty violations. International bankers noted Germany's improving creditworthiness. Meanwhile, in the shadow ledger, billions of Reichsmarks were flowing into tank factories, aircraft plants, and shipyards. The system was a time arbitrage scheme. Spend now, promise payment in 5 years, and pray that by the time the bills came due, you'd have conquered enough territory to actually pay them. It was a Ponzi scheme weaponized at the national level. Schacht understood exactly what he had created. He was not a stupid man. He was not a fanatic blinded by ideology. He was a cold, calculating technocrat who saw an opportunity to restore German power and his own prestige through financial innovation. The Mefo system worked because it exploited the fundamental gap between accounting reality and material reality. On the ledgers, Germany looked solvent, disciplined, recovering. In the factories, blast furnaces were running 24 hours a day, stamping out weapons that didn't officially exist. Schacht had discovered that if you controlled the accounting, you could conjure resources out of thin air, at least temporarily. The essential deception was temporal. Borrow against a future you have no intention of honestly repaying. By 1935, Mefo bills worth 4 billion Reichsmarks were in circulation. By 1936, the figure reached 8 billion. By 1938, 12 billion Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to Germany's entire annual GDP, existed as phantom debt on a shadow balance sheet. Every bill bore Schacht's signature. Every bill was a promissory note backed by nothing except the assumption of future conquest. Schacht knew that the system could only survive through expansion. He knew that the bills would eventually come due. He knew that when they did, Germany would either have to default, triggering economic collapse, or seize enough foreign assets to balance the books. He knew, in other words, that he was financing a war of aggression. And he signed the bills anyway, because Hjalmar Schacht believed that Germany's humiliation after World War I justified any means necessary to restore its greatness, because he believed his own genius exempted him from moral accountability, because he thought he could control the forces he was unleashing. He was wrong on all counts, Between 1933 and 1936, Germany experienced what international observers called an economic miracle. Unemployment plummeted from 6 million to under 1 million in just 3 years. Construction projects erupted across the nation. The Autobahn system alone employed hundreds of thousands. Factories that had stood silent since the Depression roared back to life. Steel mills in the Ruhr Valley operated at full capacity. Shipyards in Hamburg launched new vessels every month. To the average German worker, it felt like resurrection. Meet Otto Brenner, a composite of thousands of real men. Otto was a 32-year-old steelworker from Essen who had been unemployed since 1930. For 3 years, he had watched his children go hungry while his wife stretched potato soup across 4 meals. He had applied to 47 factories and received 47 rejections. His technical skills, 20 years of metalworking experience, had become worthless in an economy with no demand. Then, in March 1934, Otto received a letter from Krupp. Report to the factory Monday morning. Full-time position. Overtime available. Otto wept when he read it. His job, according to the paperwork, was manufacturing agricultural equipment, specifically heavy steel components for mechanical farming implements. He didn't ask questions. He had a paycheck again. He could feed his family. Every morning, Otto punched his time card and worked the massive hydraulic presses, shaping armor plating to precise specifications. The steel was too thick for tractors. The tolerances were too exact for plows. But Otto didn't mention this to his foreman. Nobody did. The factory floor was full of men who understood the unspoken agreement. We don't discuss what we're actually building. By 1936, Otto was working 60-hour weeks. He had moved his family into a larger apartment. He had purchased new furniture the first time in a decade. His oldest son had joined the Hitler Youth and spoke enthusiastically about Germany's renewal. Otto attended the factory celebration when production quotas were exceeded. He listened to speeches about German industrial prowess. He felt, for the first time since the war, like his country had a future. International economists noticed the same phenomenon. Delegations from Britain and America toured German factories and marveled at the efficiency. The unemployment statistics were undeniable. Foreign investment began flowing back into Germany. The 1936 Berlin Olympics became a showcase of the new Germany, modern, prosperous, confident. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. But the deeper story was the gleaming infrastructure, the well-fed citizens, the orchestrated impression of a nation reborn. Financial journalists praised Schacht's unorthodox but effective monetary policies. Central bankers studied the German recovery model. The consensus was clear. Whatever the Nazis' political faults, they had somehow solved the problem of Depression-era unemployment. What nobody outside Germany's inner circle understood was that the entire boom was financed by Mefo bills. Every job Otto held, every factory expansion, every kilometer of Autobahn, all of it paid for with promissory notes that would come due in 5 years, notes that had no realistic prospect of being honored except through the seizure of foreign assets. The prosperity was real in the moment, but it was built on a foundation of phantom credit that required constant expansion to avoid collapse. Behind the facade of recovery, the numbers were becoming catastrophic. By the end of 1936, Mefo bills totaling 8 billion Reichsmarks were circulating through the German economy. That represented roughly 40% of Germany's entire GDP, a debt bomb ticking toward detonation. Schacht began noticing the symptoms of systemic strain. Inflation was creeping back, masked by strict price controls. Consumer goods were disappearing from store shelves, not because of shortages in productive capacity, but because all resources were being diverted to armaments. Otto's wife Greta noticed it first. In 1934, she could buy butter, coffee, and decent fabric for clothing. By 1936, butter was rationed. Coffee was replaced with grain-based substitutes. Fabric quality had deteriorated noticeably. When she complained to the shopkeeper, he shrugged. Everything is going to the state projects. The official explanation was that Germany was building strategic reserves. The reality was simpler. You cannot simultaneously feed a population and arm a military when you're financing both with phantom money. The economic contradiction was becoming visible to anyone paying attention. Prices were frozen, but goods were vanishing. Wages were rising, but purchasing power was stagnant. The government kept announcing production increases, yet consumer shortages worsened. Schacht saw the numbers behind the propaganda. The Mefo bills were coming due. The first wave of 5-year notes, issued in 1933, would mature in 1938. 12 billion Reichsmarks would need to be paid, actually paid, not rolled over within 2 years. Germany had no mechanism to generate that kind of revenue through taxation. Foreign export earnings were insufficient. Gold reserves were negligible. In early 1937, Schacht drafted a memorandum to Hitler outlining the crisis. The language was diplomatically cautious, but the message was clear. The rearmament program must slow down, or the entire financial system would collapse. Hitler's response came through Göring. The rearmament program will accelerate. Schacht tried again in September 1937. He presented detailed projections showing that the Mefo system was mathematically unsustainable. He argued that Germany needed at least 5 years of economic stabilization before contemplating military action. He suggested focusing on export industries to generate actual foreign currency reserves. Hitler dismissed the entire analysis. "You lack faith in the German spirit," the Führer told him coldly. What Hitler understood, and what Schacht was beginning to realize with growing horror, was that the Mefo bill system had created its own terrible logic. The debt could only be serviced through expansion. The bills could only be honored through conquest. The system had locked Germany into a trajectory where peace meant financial exposure and collapse. War had become the economic necessity. By late 1937, Otto noticed the shift in factory operations. The pace accelerated. Quality control became more stringent. New workers arrived weekly, many of them from Austria after the Anschluss. The agricultural equipment they were building was now being openly described as defense materials. Otto didn't object. He had a paycheck. His family was fed. Whatever larger political or economic forces were at play seemed distant, abstract, irrelevant compared to the immediate reality of employment. This was the narcotic of the Mefo boom. It gave millions of Germans like Otto a tangible present in exchange for an invisible future cost. They could feel the paycheck. They couldn't see the debt, and by the time the bill came due, it would be paid in blood across 3 continents. December 1937. Hjalmar Schacht sat in his office at the Reichsbank, staring at a ledger that represented the most consequential moral decision of the 20th century. The numbers were irrefutable. Mefo bills outstanding, 12 billion Reichsmarks. Government revenue available for redemption, negligible. Time until first major wave of maturities, less than 1 year. Schacht had 3 options, and he understood the implications of each with perfect clarity. Option 1, continue the fraud. Keep issuing Mefo bills. Keep rolling over the debt. Keep pretending the system was sustainable. This path led inexorably to war, the only mechanism that could generate the resources needed to service the phantom debt. Option 2, slow the rearmament program. Refuse to issue new Mefo bills. Force fiscal discipline. Accept a temporary economic contraction. This path would expose Germany's insolvency, trigger unemployment, probably end his career, and almost certainly result in political chaos. Option 3, expose the entire scheme. Go public with a shadow ledger. Reveal the scale of the fraud. Crash the system intentionally before it could metastasize into something worse. This path would destroy him personally, devastate Germany's economy, and likely trigger his own arrest or assassination. Schacht chose none of them. Instead, he chose a 4th option, moral evasion. He would continue issuing bills while simultaneously distancing himself from the consequences, building a paper trail of objections that might exonerate him later, maintaining plausible deniability while keeping the machine running. It was the choice of a coward disguised as pragmatism. But here's the historical question that haunts every serious examination of this period. Could Schacht have stopped World War II? Not alone, certainly. Not through simple resignation. But if Schacht had chosen option 3 in December 1937, if he had walked into the international press and said, "Germany is bankrupt, the rearmament program is financed by fraud, and the Nazi government is preparing for a war of conquest to service unpayable debts," what happens? the international reaction would have been seismic. British and French intelligence would have confirmed his claims within weeks. The League of Nations would have been forced to act. Foreign banks would have immediately frozen all German credit. The Mefo scheme would have been exposed as the largest financial fraud in history. Hitler's regime, barely 5 years old, would have faced immediate economic catastrophe. The German people, still recovering from Weimar hyperinflation, would have understood the implications. They'd been lied to, again. The military, heavily dependent on Mefo-financed production, would have faced immediate supply disruptions. Would this have prevented the war? Possibly not. Hitler might have attempted a desperate military gambit anyway. The Nazi Party might have consolidated power through even more brutal repression. But the timeline would have been disrupted. The rearmament would have been crippled. The industrial capacity that overwhelmed Poland in 1939 and France in 1940 would not have existed. At minimum, Schacht's exposure of the fraud would have bought time years, perhaps for Britain and France to rearm, for anti-Nazi resistance to organize, for anti-Nazi resistance to coalesce. This is the Ferguson principle. Contingency matters. History is not an inevitable march toward predetermined outcomes. Individual decisions, especially by individuals with institutional power, can redirect entire civilizations. Schacht had that power in December 1937. One man, with access to the ledgers, with international credibility, with the technical knowledge to explain exactly how the fraud worked. He chose not to use it, not because he couldn't see the consequences, but because he valued his own position more than the millions of lives those consequences would eventually consume. The deeper tragedy is that by December 1937, the Mefo system had created a fragility trap that made rational de-escalation nearly impossible. The logic was brutally simple. The system only survived through expansion. Every month that passed without territorial conquest made the next month's debt burden more crushing. Every Mefo bill that matured without being honored increased the pressure to issue new bills to cover the old ones. It was a debt spiral at the national level, but with the uniquely horrifying characteristic, the only collateral available was other countries' assets. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria the Anschluss. The official justification was ethnic and political unity. The financial reality was more prosaic. Austria had gold reserves. The Reichsbank immediately seized 1.4 billion shillings in gold and foreign currency from Austrian banks. This injection of liquidity temporarily stabilized the Mefo system, allowing Schacht to roll over maturing bills without immediate default. Hitler learned the lesson instantly. Conquest pays the bills. 6 months later, in September 1938, Germany seized the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Again, the propaganda emphasized ethnic Germans requiring protection. Again, the financial motive was dominant. Czechoslovakia's industrial base and currency reserves provided another temporary reprieve. By March 1939, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The Czech National Bank's gold reserves, valued at $48 million, were immediately transferred to Berlin. Schacht watched this pattern with growing horror. He had created a financial weapon that required continuous feeding. Each conquest provided just enough resources to delay collapse for another 6 to 12 months. But each conquest also increased the scale of the debt, requiring an even larger next conquest to maintain the illusion of solvency. It was Ponzi warfare. The scheme could only survive by continuously acquiring new assets to pay previous obligations. And the terrible mathematics were accelerating. By early 1939, Germany's military expenditures exceeded 50% of GDP, a figure unprecedented in peacetime history. Consumer goods production had been slashed to bare minimum levels. Rationing was becoming severe. The German people were being told to accept shortages as temporary sacrifices for national greatness. But Schacht knew the truth. The shortages were permanent features of a system that diverted all resources to servicing unpayable debt through military expansion. Poland was the next mathematical necessity, not because of Danzig, not because of the Polish corridor, but because Germany needed Poland's agricultural output, industrial capacity, and financial reserves to maintain solvency for another year. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 wasn't a political decision that happened to have economic benefits. It was an economic requirement that was given political justification. This is the part of World War II's origin story that makes technocrats deeply uncomfortable. The war was financially overdetermined. Once Schacht created the Mefo system, once Hitler accelerated rearmament beyond sustainable levels, once the first conquests proved that territorial expansion could temporarily service the debt, the path to general war became nearly inevitable. You cannot build a system that requires continuous conquest and then expect restraint. You cannot finance phantom prosperity with shadow currency and then expect voluntary austerity. You cannot add a nation to military Keynesianism and then expect peaceful de-escalation. Schacht understood this by 1938. He watched the fragility trap close around Germany like a steel vice, and his response was to resign quietly, preserve his reputation, and later claim he had opposed the madness all along. He did oppose it with memos, with careful objections filed in triplicate, with the kind of bureaucratic resistance that provides legal cover while changing nothing. What he didn't do was blow the whistle. What he didn't do was expose the fraud to international scrutiny. What he didn't do was accept personal destruction to prevent collective catastrophe. And so the machine he built continued operating, consuming first Austria, then Czechoslovakia, then Poland, then France, then the Soviet Union, until it finally consumed Germany itself in a bonfire of its own monetary fiction. January 19, 1939. The day Hjalmar Schacht lost control of the monster he had created. He was summoned to the Reich Chancellery for what he assumed would be another tedious budget meeting. Instead, he found Hermann Göring waiting with the prepared statement. The Führer has decided that your services as president of the Reichsbank are no longer required. Schacht's dismissal was bureaucratically efficient and brutally final. No negotiation, no explanation beyond the obvious. He had become an obstacle. The final confrontation had occurred 3 weeks earlier, on December 27, 1938. Schacht had submitted a memorandum, his most forceful yet outlining the mathematical impossibility of the current trajectory. The language was uncharacteristically blunt. The present policy of unlimited armament expenditure will lead to state bankruptcy and the destruction of the German economy. He demanded immediate spending cuts. He demanded an end to new Mefo bill issuance. He demanded a return to orthodox fiscal discipline. Hitler's response was delivered through Göring with cold clarity. The rearmament program will not merely continue, it will accelerate. If you cannot facilitate this, we will find someone who can. Schacht made one final attempt at moral positioning. I cannot, in good conscience, continue to operate a system I know to be fraudulent and unsustainable. Göring's reply has been preserved in multiple historical accounts. Your conscience is noted. Your resignation is accepted. Walther Funk will assume your duties immediately. Walther Funk was everything Schacht was not: a loyal Nazi Party member, economically incompetent, and willing to sign whatever documents were placed before him. The transition was seamless. Funk took control of the Reichsbank on January 20, 1939. Within weeks, he had approved another 4 billion Reichsmarks in Mefo-style instruments. The system Schacht had tried to restrain was now operating without any internal resistance whatsoever. Schacht retreated to his estate, maintaining the fiction that he remained minister without portfolio, a title that granted status but no actual authority. He would later claim this was a form of internal resistance. It was actually strategic self-preservation. He kept his distance from the regime while maintaining just enough connection to protect his assets and avoid arrest. The symbolic moment of January 19, 1939, represents something larger than one man's firing. It was the moment when financial constraint ceased to function as a brake on German aggression. With Schacht's dismissal, the last technocratic voice urging caution was silenced. Göring, now in complete control of economic policy, operated under a single principle: produce whatever the military demands regardless of cost, regardless of sustainability. The Mefo bills were no longer being issued with even the pretense of future redemption. They were simply being printed to convert present resources into weapons of direct monetization of state power, with no concern for eventual payment. By summer 1939, the German economy was running entirely on wartime mobilization logic. Consumer goods production had been cut by 40% from 1937 levels. Food rationing was severe. Foreign currency reserves were exhausted. The only question was not whether Germany would go to war, but when and against whom. September 1, 1939, 4:45 a.m. German forces crossed the Polish border. The Second World War began not with a political miscalculation, but with an economic necessity. Poland represented everything the Mefo system required: agricultural output to feed the German population, industrial capacity to sustain armament production, and financial assets to temporarily service the accumulated debt. The invasion lasted 35 days. By October 6, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state, and the liquidation began immediately. The Reichsbank dispatched specialized teams to Warsaw within days of the city's fall. Their mandate was simple: inventory and seize all financial assets. The Polish National Bank's gold reserves, 80 tons, were transferred to Berlin. Foreign currency holdings were confiscated. Industrial equipment was catalogued for relocation to German factories. But the real payment came through something far more sinister: the systematic expropriation of Jewish wealth. Poland's Jewish population, over 3 million people, held significant private assets, property, businesses, savings, jewelry, artwork. Nazi economic planners understood that total war required total mobilization of resources, and Jewish assets represented an enormous pool of confiscatable wealth. The progression was methodical. First came registration. All Jewish property had to be declared. Then came segregation. Jews were confined to ghettos, making asset seizure logistically simpler. Then came liquidation. Property sold at forced prices. Businesses transferred to Aryan owners. Personal wealth confiscated outright. The seized assets flowed directly into the war economy. Jewish-owned factories became armament plants. Confiscated gold was melted down and deposited in the Reichsbank. Stolen artwork was sold through Swiss intermediaries to generate foreign currency. This was the Holocaust's financial dimension, a reality that makes most historians deeply uncomfortable. The genocide was ideologically driven, absolutely, but it was also economically functional within the logic of the Mefo system. The Nazi state needed continuous asset acquisition to service debt. Jewish wealth was systematically categorized as an available resource pool. The two motivations, ideological hatred and economic desperation, reinforced each other in a horrifying feedback loop. By 1941, the pattern had expanded across Europe. France fell in June 1940. The French treasury held $2 billion in gold reserves, the second largest in Europe. The Reichsbank seized it within weeks. French industrial capacity was immediately subordinated to German production needs. French agricultural output was requisitioned to feed German cities. The Low Countries, Denmark, Norway, each conquest provided another temporary injection of liquidity. But the mathematics of the Ponzi scheme were relentless. Each conquest had to be larger than the last to maintain the system. Poland bought Germany 6 months. France bought another year. By June 1941, the system demanded something massive. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in human history. 3 million German soldiers advanced across a 1,800-mile front. The strategic objective was presented as ideological, Lebensraum, the destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism. The economic objective was existential. The Soviet Union's oil fields, wheat production, and industrial resources represented the only asset pool large enough to service Germany's accumulated debt. Hitler told his generals explicitly, "The war can only be continued if the entire Wehrmacht is fed from Russia in the 3rd year." This was not rhetoric. This was accounting. Germany's food situation was critical. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. The Mefo bills and their successors now totaled over 40 billion Reichsmarks in accumulated obligations. The Soviet Union had to be conquered, its resources extracted, or the entire German economy would collapse within months. This is the ultimate horror of Schacht's creation. It transformed geopolitical aggression into economic necessity. Wars were no longer political decisions, they were accounting requirements. Conquests were no longer ideological preferences, they were balance sheet imperatives. And when the conquest failed, when the Wehrmacht stalled outside Moscow in December 1941, when Stalingrad became a meat grinder in 1942, when the Soviet counteroffensive began grinding westward, the entire fraudulent structure began its terminal collapse. By 1943, Germany was consuming more resources than it could extract from occupied territories. By 1944, the currency was inflating despite brutal price controls. By 1945, the Mefo bills and all their successor instruments were revealed as exactly what they always were: worthless paper backed by a promise that would never be kept. The system consumed 50 million lives before it finally consumed itself. And in the ruins of Berlin, amid the rubble of the Reichsbank, you could find those Mefo bills still printed with Schacht's signature, still promising payment in 5 years, still representing the most catastrophic financial fraud in human history. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, collapsed after 12. The Mefo bills, all 40 billion Reichsmarks worth, were now literally worthless. But here's the question nobody wanted to ask in 1945. Who actually profited from the greatest financial fraud in history? The answer is uncomfortable. American corporations had subsidiaries operating throughout Nazi Germany. IBM's German subsidiary, Hjalmar, provided the punch card systems that cataloged concentration camp prisoners. Ford Werk and Opel, owned by General Motors, manufactured trucks for the Wehrmacht. ITT maintained communication infrastructure across occupied Europe. These companies continued operations and continued profiting throughout the war. When Germany seized assets in conquered territories, American subsidiaries often received Aryanized Jewish properties and businesses. The corporate leadership claimed they had no control over their German operations after 1941. The financial records tell a different story. Profits were repatriated through neutral countries throughout the conflict. After the war, many of these corporations filed claims with the U.S. government for war damages to their German facilities that had been bombed by Allied forces. They received compensation. Then there were the Swiss banks. Neutral Switzerland became the financial laundromat for Nazi gold. The Swiss National Bank accepted over $400 million in gold from the Reichsbank between 1939 and 1945. Much of this gold was stolen from the national banks of conquered countries, from private Jewish accounts, even melted down from dental fillings and jewelry confiscated in concentration camps. Swiss bankers conducted due diligence by checking that the gold bars had proper smelting stamps. They didn't ask where the gold originated. They didn't investigate the serial numbers that matched pre-war Belgian or Dutch reserves. They simply converted Nazi plunder into Swiss francs, providing the Reich with neutral currency to purchase war materials from other neutral nations. After the war, Switzerland returned a fraction of the stolen gold after decades of international pressure. The rest was quietly absorbed into the Swiss banking system. No Swiss banker faced prosecution. The most grotesque profiteers were the scavengers who emerged from the ruins. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States. Many had direct connections to the Nazi war machine. Werner von Braun, architect of the V-2 rocket program, had used concentration camp slave labor to build his weapons. He became the face of the American space program. Arthur Rudolph, operations director of the Mittelwerk facility where 20,000 slave laborers died, received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal. Kurt Blome, who conducted biological warfare experiments, was hired by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. The Americans weren't alone. The Soviets captured German industrial equipment. Wholesale entire factories were dismantled and shipped east. The British recruited German intelligence officers to help establish Cold War espionage networks. Everyone wanted access to the technical knowledge that the Mefo billions had purchased. Nobody wanted to prosecute the men who had enabled the purchasing. And then there was Schacht himself. Hjalmar Schacht was arrested by American forces in June 1945. He was charged at Nuremberg with crimes against peace, conspiracy to wage aggressive war, and war crimes. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Schacht's Mefo bills had made German rearmament possible. Rearmament had made the war possible. Therefore, Schacht bore direct responsibility for the conflict. Schacht's defense was equally straightforward. He was a technocrat following orders. He had resigned in protest. He had even been briefly imprisoned by the Nazis in 1944 after being tangentially connected to the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. On October 1, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict, not guilty. The judges acknowledged that Schacht had facilitated rearmament. They acknowledged that his financial innovations had violated the Treaty of Versailles, but they determined that his actions, however enabling, did not constitute direct participation in war crimes or crimes against humanity. He had created the weapon. He hadn't pulled the trigger. The distinction was enough. Schacht walked free. He was immediately rearrested by German denazification courts and sentenced to 8 years in a labor camp. He served less than 2 years before being released in 1948. He lived comfortably on his substantial assets, carefully protected in Swiss accounts throughout the war, until his death in 1970 at age 93. He died wealthy, free, and convinced of his own innocence. Meanwhile, Otto Brenner Auer, composite steelworker from Essen, died on the Eastern Front in November 1943. He was killed during the retreat from Kiev, shot through the chest while trying to protect a disabled tank. He was 42 years old. He never knew that his employment from 1934 to 1943 had been financed by worthless paper. He never understood that the agricultural equipment he manufactured had killed millions. He never learned that the economic miracle that saved his family was a Ponzi scheme that would eventually consume his life. Otto's wife, Greta, survived the war. She lived through the Allied bombing of Essen. She survived the Soviet occupation. She endured the starvation winter of 1945-46. In 1948, when the Deutsche Mark replaced the Reichsmark, her life savings, carefully accumulated during Otto's boom years, were converted at a rate that rendered them nearly worthless. The money Otto had earned building tanks, the money that had fed their children and paid their rent, vanished as completely as the Mefo bills themselves. She died in 1954, impoverished, in a one-room apartment in the ruins of what had been Essen's industrial district. Multiply Otto and Greta by 50 million. That's the human cost of Schacht's innovation. Soviet civilians starved in besieged cities. Jewish families were murdered in industrial death camps. Their assets seized to service the debt that funded their own destruction. British families were buried under rubble from bombs built with Mefo-financed steel. French resistance fighters were executed for opposing an occupation made possible by shadow currency. American soldiers died on beaches storming fortifications constructed with fraudulent credit. And the German people, the supposed beneficiaries of Schacht's genius, lost an entire generation, saw their cities reduced to rubble, and inherited a moral debt that no currency could ever repay. The ultimate accounting was this. Schacht's Mefo system generated approximately 40 billion Reichsmarks in phantom purchasing power between 1933 and 1945. That money built 5,000 tanks, 20,000 aircraft, 1,000 submarines, and munitions sufficient to supply a military campaign across 3 continents. The return on that investment: 80 million dead, Europe in ruins, Germany divided for 40 years, and a moral catastrophe so profound that its echoes still distort global politics 80 years later. But Hjalmar Schacht served less than 2 years in prison. The corporations that profited from slave labor paid modest fines, if they paid anything at all. The Swiss banks that laundered stolen gold returned a fraction after decades of stonewalling. The scientists who built weapons with concentration camp slaves received American pensions and honors. This is the most disturbing lesson of the Mefo bills. The men who enable catastrophe through financial innovation almost never face consequences proportional to the harm they cause. They were just doing their jobs. They were following the prevailing economic theories. They were technocrats, not ideologues. The same words that central bankers use today when their policies generate crises. The same excuses that financial engineers offer when their innovations explode. The same evasions that allow the architects of systemic fraud to retire wealthy while their victims rot in unmarked graves. Schacht lives 34 years after being acquitted at Nuremberg. He never expressed remorse. He never acknowledged moral responsibility. He never admitted that his signature on those bills represented anything more than technical economic management. He wrote his memoirs, gave interviews, and insisted until his death that he had been a voice of reason in an unreasonable time. History has been remarkably generous to him. Most economics textbooks mention the Mefo bills as a creative solution to Depression-era constraints. Some praise Schacht's unorthodox monetary policy. Very few connect the dots. Those bills purchased Auschwitz's crematoria, Stalingrad's ruins, and Hiroshima's ashes. That was the true liquidation not of assets, but of humanity itself. financed one worthless bill at a time. Return to that Mefo bill from 1935. Hold it again in your palm. Now that you know its history, what does it tell you about the world you live in today? The paper feels different now. It's not just a historical artifact. It's a warning label that nobody read. Because here's the uncomfortable truth, we're doing it again. The names have changed. The mechanisms have been updated. The justifications sound more sophisticated. But the fundamental logic creating phantom purchasing power through financial engineering, deferring payment indefinitely, praying that future growth will somehow validate present consumption remains exactly the same. Consider quantitative easing. Between 2008 and 2022, the Federal Reserve, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and Bank of England collectively created over $25 trillion in new money, not by mining gold, not by increasing productive capacity, but by purchasing government bonds and other securities with electronically created currency. The official explanation: stimulating economic growth, preventing deflation, supporting employment. The functional reality: allowing governments to finance present spending without immediate taxation, pushing the bill into the future, hoping that somehow the debt becomes manageable through growth that may never materialize. Sound familiar? Or consider special purpose vehicles, the modern corporate equivalent of Mefo. Companies create shell entities to hold debt off their official balance sheets. The SPVs issue bonds. The parent company guarantees the debt implicitly but not explicitly. Investors treat the bonds as solid. Regulators classify them as separate from the parent's liabilities, until the system freezes as it did in 2008, and suddenly everyone realizes that the separate entities were never separate at all. Lehman Brothers had over 2,500 SPVs when it collapsed. Enron pioneered the technique a decade earlier. The mechanism is identical to Schacht's innovation. Create an entity that appears independent. Use it to generate purchasing power without officially increasing debt. Maintain the fiction until the system collapses. Then there's sovereign debt. Japan's government debt exceeds 260% of GDP. The United States federal debt exceeds $36 trillion, over 120% of GDP, and climbing. European nations collectively owe more than they produce annually. The standard response: we owe it to ourselves. We can always print more money. Debt doesn't matter at these interest rates. This is Mefo logic in macroeconomic form. The debt is real. The payment obligations are real. But the assumption is that economic growth will eventually make the debt manageable, or that the debt can simply be refinanced indefinitely, rolled over forever, never actually paid. What happens when growth doesn't materialize? What happens when interest rates rise and debt service consumes increasing portions of tax revenue? What happens when the bills come due and there's no conquered territory to loot? China offers perhaps the most direct parallel: local government financing vehicles. LGFVs are essentially Chinese Mefo bills. Provincial governments create shell companies. The shell companies borrow money to finance infrastructure projects. The debt doesn't appear on official government balance sheets. The central government implicitly guarantees the debt without explicitly acknowledging it. By 2024, LGFV debt exceeded 9 trillion twillions, roughly 50% of China's GDP. The projects financed by this debt include ghost cities, redundant highways, and bridges to nowhere. The economic justification is stimulating growth and employment. The financial reality is a massive shadow debt that has no clear repayment mechanism beyond continuous economic expansion at rates that may be unsustainable. China's government insists the debt is manageable. So did Schacht in 1937. The difference between LGFVs and Mefo bills is primarily technological. China uses digital ledgers instead of paper instruments. The logic is identical. Spend now, promise payment later, hope that future growth validates present consumption. And then there's cryptocurrency. Bitcoin and its descendants are presented as alternatives to government-manipulated fiat currency. But look closer at the ecosystem. Tether, the most widely used stablecoin, claims to be backed by dollar reserves, but its reserves are held in commercial paper, corporate bonds, and other assets that are themselves subject to market volatility. It's a shadow currency backed by promises, functioning as a medium of exchange for transactions that exist in a regulatory gray zone. When the crypto market collapsed in 2022, over $2 trillion in market value vanished. That value had been treated as real by millions of investors. It had been used as collateral for loans. It had financed real purchases and real consumption, and it disappeared because it was always phantom value, backed by the collective belief that someone else would pay more tomorrow than you paid today. Mefo bills for the digital age. Hjalmar Schacht died wealthy and free because he successfully argued that he was just a technocrat, just managing the numbers, just following economic logic, just doing his professional duty within the system he inherited. This defense works because we, as a society, have accepted a dangerous fiction that technical expertise exempts one from moral responsibility, that bankers, economists, and financial engineers are merely neutral facilitators implementing value-free mathematical optimization, that creating innovative financial instruments is morally equivalent to inventing better mousetraps, a purely technical achievement with no ethical dimension. This is a lie. Financial innovation is never neutral. Money is power in liquid form. Creating new mechanisms for generating purchasing power is creating new mechanisms for concentrating and deploying power, and power always has moral implications. Schacht's Mefo bills weren't just clever accounting. They were weapons that killed tens of millions of people. The financial engineers who created synthetic CDOs in the 2000s weren't just optimizing returns. They were building systemic fragility that destroyed millions of families' wealth in 2008. The central bankers pursuing unlimited quantitative easing aren't just managing monetary policy. They're making choices about who benefits from newly created money and who bears the cost of resulting inflation. These are moral decisions. They have winners and losers. They have consequences that extend far beyond balance sheets, and the people making them bear responsibility for those consequences. So who are today's Schachts? Who are the respectable technocrats building financial weapons that might detonate in ways they claim not to foresee? They're in every central bank, creating trillions in new money with unclear long-term effects. They're in investment banks, designing derivative instruments so complex that even the firms selling them don't fully understand the risk exposures. They're in fintech startups, building shadow banking systems that operate outside regulatory frameworks. They're in government treasury departments, issuing debt at unprecedented levels while assuming that future growth will somehow validate present consumption. They're not villains. Most of them have PhDs. Most of them believe they're serving the public good. Most of them would be genuinely shocked to be compared to the man who financed the Third Reich. But that's exactly the point. Schacht didn't think he was enabling genocide. He thought he was solving Germany's unemployment problem. He thought he was restoring national dignity. He thought he was just doing his job as a professional economist. The road to systemic catastrophe is paved with professional competence applied without moral reflection. The pattern repeats because we never learn the fundamental lesson. Financial innovation that creates purchasing power without corresponding real wealth is inherently dangerous. It can work temporarily. It can generate what looks like prosperity. But eventually, reality reasserts itself. The phantom money is revealed as phantom. The debt comes due, and someone, usually not the architects, pays the price. This Mefo bill in your hand represents both human ingenuity and human catastrophe. It shows what's possible when brilliant minds apply themselves to solving immediate problems without considering long-term consequences. It shows how technical expertise can be weaponized when divorced from ethical constraints. It shows how systems of deferred payment can metastasize into systems of deferred accountability. And most importantly, it shows that financial fraud scales to the size of the political entity backing it. Schacht's fraud was national, so it consumed a continent. Today's financial engineering is global. If it unravels at the scale Schacht's system did, if the accumulated shadow debts, off-balance sheet obligations, and phantom currencies collapse simultaneously, the consequences won't be limited to one region or one generation. The bill will come due for everyone. The question is whether we'll recognize the warning signs before that happens, whether we'll demand transparency instead of accepting complexity as unavoidable, whether we'll hold financial engineers morally accountable instead of treating them as neutral technicians, Whether we'll insist that money creation be tied to real wealth creation instead of accepting unlimited debt expansion as normal. The Mefo bill's final lesson is this: there is no such thing as a free lunch. You can defer payment. You can hide debt on shadow ledgers. You can create purchasing power through financial innovation, but you cannot escape the fundamental economic reality that wealth must be produced before it can be consumed. Every Mefo bill was a promise that Germany would eventually produce enough wealth to honor its obligations. Germany chose conquest instead of production. 50 million people died as a result, and Hjalmar Schacht, the architect of the fraud, lived to age 93, wealthy and free, insisting until his death that he bore no responsibility for the catastrophe his innovation enabled. That is the true horror. Not that the system failed, but that the men who built it faced no consequences. Look at that Mefo bill one last time. Now look at your bank statement, your pension fund, your government's balance sheet, and ask yourself, what phantom promises am I holding? What Mefo bills are circulating through my economy right now, bearing the signatures of respectable technocrats who will claim innocence when the system collapses? The paper in your hand is a mirror. It's showing you not what happened then, but what's happening now. The only question is whether we'll recognize it before the bill comes due.